On a quiet residential street in a sleepy town in California, a little girl is kept in a homemade straitjacket and tied down to a chair. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. In October of 1970, a mother and her child would wander into the Los Angeles County Welfare Office accidentally. The girl's mother, Irene, had cataracts and was seeking an office with services for the blind and had entered the wrong room. For people who have cataracts, it's basically this clouding over the eye, so when you see things, you see them cloudy. This woman, known as Irene Wiley, would take her daughter Genie with her. And as they entered the welfare offices accidentally, people took notice that her daughter had some strange behaviors. Immediately, the welfare officers noticed that something was wrong with Genie. They noticed the little girl appeared to be 6 or 7 years old, and she held her hands like a rabbit. And she didn't really walk, but instead she kind of just hopped around. At first, everyone thought that perhaps this girl had autism, but as they began to look more closely, they realized not only could she not talk, but she had 2 sets of teeth growing in, and they were almost complete sets of teeth. She could barely chew or swallow, and she couldn't extend her limbs properly. The little girl only weighed 59 pounds, and they would soon learn that this little girl was not 6 or 7 years old, but she was 13. Clark Wiley was a former assembly line machinist raised in and out of brothels by his mother. Some articles did say that he spent time in and out of foster care, and that this childhood had a profound effect on Clark Wiley. That basically his whole life, he was just absolutely fixated on his mother. Irene Wiley was much younger than her husband, Clark Wiley, and it seemed that she wasn't spared from his abusive ways. It was well known that Clark Wiley was very controlling and that he never wanted children. It seemed that he hated the noise that children brought and the stress of just having children in general. But this didn't stop the couple from welcoming their first child. Their first child was a baby girl, but unfortunately she would not survive Clark Wiley. Because this child was a baby, obviously babies cry when they need things, and because she was crying, Clark Wiley grew so angry that he left the baby in a cold garage, and she froze to death. One may think that this stopped the Wileys from having children, but it didn't. After Clark murdered their first child, they would get pregnant with a second child. But the second child would die of a congenital defect, and then they would welcome their third child, John. John would survive and make it past childhood, and 5 years later, they welcomed another daughter known as Genie. Although John was abused and abused terribly by his father, Genie would take on the burden of her father's rage. A year after Genie was born, Clark Wiley's mother was killed by a drunk driver, and this really seemed to be his undoing. Although he had always been controlling and abusive to his family, his rage, his anger, it all became more sadistic. John did experience the wrath of his father, and I don't want to minimize that. Clark brutalized John. He was an absolute monster. But it seems like he took most of his anger out on Genie. And as I was researching, I couldn't help but wonder if he did this because she was a girl, and he had some complicated feelings about his mother. Without any sort of formal diagnosis, Clark Wiley decided that his daughter was mentally disabled and needed to be kept away from society. He determined that she was just going to be useless and that society didn't need her. Clark Wiley would banish his daughter Genie from society and society from Genie. The little girl wasn't even able to interact with her mother or her brother John. Clark would begin by locking his 20-month-old daughter in a room by herself. She was isolated in there, barely able to move. It was incredibly dark. He kept tinfoil over the windows to make sure nobody could see in. When she wasn't harnessed down to a potty seat because she wasn't potty trained yet, he kept her in this makeshift homemade straitjacket and a wire mesh covered crib. Clark would basically take chicken coop wire and turn Genie's crib into a cage. And as I mentioned, he hated the sound of children. He hated noise, so anytime Genie cried or really did anything, she was met with violence. He would hit her, and I don't mean slap her, he would punch her. And eventually he would move to taking a board and beating her with that wooden board. And really, that's what Genie's life looked like for 11 years. Although I'm positive the first 2 years weren't great either. Obviously, we can see that Clark Wiley was completely unhinged, but some of the things he did were just completely insane. Not only would he beat her with a large plank of wood for anything she did, but oftentimes he would stand outside her door and growl at her like a dog. Some experts do believe that she was also sexually abused. I want to pause for a moment and go back to her brother John because his story is just as important, but really when this all came out, the focus was on Genie. And John was kind of left in the dust. He was an abused child, he did grow up in the same home, but nobody really reported on that. At the age of 6, John Wiley was on a California street with his grandmother, headed to buy ice cream. She had taken him in because she believed her son, Clark Wiley, was an unstable parent. On that day, as they're on the street and they're walking to get ice cream, a drunk driver hits his grandmother, and he had to watch this unfold. This drunk driver hits her and drives her mangled body. He doesn't stop. Unfortunately, now that his grandmother was dead, this meant John had to go and live with Irene and Clark again. John would say that after his grandmother died and he had to go back home to Clark and Irene, they lived in the living room together. Jeannie was placed in a room and isolated. The other room was left as a shrine to his grandmother, so that left the three of them in the family room. Clark would sleep in a recliner, his mother would sleep in a chair at the dining room table, and John would sleep on the floor. I do want to stop and point out the obvious here, that this is abuse. Clark forced his family to stay in one room together, and I really do feel like it was a form of control. Irene had to sleep at the dining room table in a chair. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that life was for her. And little John, who deserved a bedroom and a loving family, was sleeping on the floor. As John was reaching his adolescence, his father would punish him for his, quote, growing sexuality. One day, he took his son, he tied his legs to a chair, and he took the board that he beat Jeannie with, and he would take that board and he'd beat his son's genitals. John would go on to say, "I don't think he wanted me to have children, and it's a wonder I did. He would write me a note excusing me from gym so the kids didn't see my privates in the showers." So really, John's only chance at life was his grandmother, who was killed in a tragic accident. And from that point forward, his life was absolute hell. At age 18, he would run away because he just could no longer deal with the abusive environment that he was in. Around this time, Irene and Jeannie escaped to her parents' home in 1970, and shortly after, they accidentally wandered in to the welfare offices. And the welfare officers would actually tip off police and say, "I think we have an abuse case here." And the police would take it seriously and go investigate. When the officers arrived at Clark Wiley's home, they were met with a disturbing scene. The arresting officer would say that Jeannie slept in a crib formed with chicken wire attached with a latch. It was a cage for the child. The window was covered with aluminum foil to reflect out the sunlight. The room was as dark as a coal mine at midnight. Police found meticulous logs noting each time the paranoid father locked a door or shrouded the windows from nosy neighbors. He was a total dictator in the house. His word was law. Hitler could have taken lessons from him. Obviously, Clark Wiley was arrested for child abuse, and on the day he was supposed to appear in court, John and a friend of John's were standing outside the home waiting for his father when they heard a gunshot. His father had killed himself, and in the process, he left his funeral clothes laid out on the bed, 2 separate notes, and $400 for John. The note he wrote to his son said, "Be a good boy, I love you." And in the other note, he stated, "The world would never understand." But the world wanted to understand, and they deeply wanted to understand what happened here. And that would throw Jeannie into the next phase of her life. Jeannie was now a ward of the court and was moved to the LA Children's Hospital. Pediatricians, psychologists, linguistics, and other experts from around the world petitioned to examine, treat her, and study the effects of this feral child. They very much knew this was a unique opportunity to study the brain in a child who basically had no human contact other than abuse. By all accounts, Jeannie was a feral child. Jeannie could say a few words like blue, orange, and mother. She would say go, but mostly she just didn't have a vocabulary. They noted that she shuffled basically with a bunny hop, and they noticed when she was stressed out that she would have a very biological response. She would either urinate on herself or defecate. Doctors would call her the most profoundly damaged child that they had ever seen. But progress was initially going really well. Jeannie learned to play and chew and dress herself, and she really enjoyed music. They did help her expand her vocabulary, and she sketched pictures to communicate when she couldn't find the words to talk. And to everyone's surprise, she did perform quite well on intelligence tests. Eventually, she could construct simple sentences when she wanted something. She would say something like applesauce by store. But they would say that the nuances of a more sophisticated sentence structure were out of her grasp, and this demonstrated that language is different from thought. A member of the research team would go on to say, language and thought are distinct from each other. For many of us, our thoughts are verbal encoded. For Genie, her thoughts were virtually never verbally encoded, but there are many ways to think. She was smart. She could hold a set of pictures so they told a story. She could create sorts of complex structures from sticks. She had other signs of intelligence. The lights were on. And this researcher would form quite a bond with Genie. They went out on walks and on shopping trips. And during these shopping trips, they were looking for plastic buckets because Genie had apparently been really into them. She had been collecting them at that point. And the researcher would say that anywhere she went, she just enchanted people by her spirit and the way she communicated. Although Genie could learn, they soon realized that teaching grammar and sentence structure and basically forming words into sentences that make sense were beyond Genie. So they basically said that beyond a certain age, it's just too late. And this researcher believed this window pretty much closed between the ages of 5 and 10. But Genie, in her own words, would recall her abuse. Genie would say, father hit arm, big wood, Genie cry, not spit. Father hit face, spit. Father hit big stick, father is angry, father hit Genie, big stick. Father take piece wood, hit. Cry, father make me cry. The research team explored the developmental consequences of extreme isolation for 4 years from 1971 to 1975. And really, for those 4 years, Genie became the center of those researchers' lives. One of these members on the team was Susie Curtis, and her job was to focus on linguistics. She would go on to say, she wasn't socialized and her behavior was distasteful, but she just captivated us with her beauty. But during those 4 years, many people would call into question the ethics of this research. Genie would often live with the researchers so that they could study her basically around the clock and help her and work with her. And many people believed this could potentially lead to more abuse for the little girl. Up until the late 1960s, it was largely believed by linguistics that children could not learn language after puberty. But Genie, the feral child, disproved this. She had a thirst for learning and curiosity, and her researchers found her highly communicative. It turned out that Wiley could learn language, but grammar and sentence structure were another thing entirely. But by 1972, feuds within the research team would begin to divide them. Jean Butler, who was a rehabilitator teacher, began to clash with the team, so she enlisted Irene, Genie's mother, to help her with her cause. Each side would accuse each other of exploitation. Jean Butler in 1971 would obtain permission to bring Genie home with her. And this was so that they could begin the socialization process. This arrangement did work out for quite some time. Everything was well. That is until Jean Butler decided to cut off the rest of the research team. And she would say that she did this because the team was subjecting her to too much scrutiny. Other members of the team would then accuse Jean Butler of exploiting this little girl, Genie, and they said that basically she was trying to be the next Anne Sullivan, and that was the teacher that had helped Helen Keller. Although Genie was making progress, the study ran out of funding in 1975, and Genie would be sent to live with her mother for a brief amount of time. In 1979, her mother Irene filed a lawsuit against the hospital and her daughter's individual caregivers, including the scientists on the Genie team. She alleged they exploited her daughter for prestige and profit. The suit was settled in 1984, and then Genie Wiley wasn't allowed to have contact basically with the researchers. At this time, Genie was placed in a number of foster homes, some of which were incredibly abusive. Oftentimes, she was beaten for vomiting, and at this time, she regressed greatly. And unfortunately, Genie would never regain the progress that she had made with the research team. Eventually, her mother would get custody of Genie, but she wouldn't let anybody near her daughter from that point forward, so little is known what happened over those years. Irene would die in 2003, and as of 2008, Genie Wiley was living in an assisted care facility in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, this story is just not a happy one in any sort of form. Her first 11 years were full of terror, and then she's thrusted into the spotlight where she's starting to get help, and then it just all falls apart and she's thrown into foster care where she's abused, and she just reverts right back to the way she was. Had a good foster home taken her in and worked with her, who knows what could have happened. She was really failed by society at every step, not only really by these researchers, but by foster carers, by her mother, by her father, everybody failed her. Much like his sister, John really struggled up until his death in 2011. After his father's death, he did move around a lot and was in trouble with the law. He would spend 10 days in jail for stealing cars, and then he would join the Navy. He was discharged only 182 days later. He had no education and really no skills at this point, so he did move to a sleepy town in Ohio, which had been hit hard by the economy and had really slowed down. He did marry eventually and have a daughter, even though he never wanted children, much like his father. He did say that he was afraid to have kids because of his upbringing. After his marriage ended after 17 years, his daughter did turn to drugs to cope with her family situation. At the time that John spoke during this interview, he was a diabetic who had no health insurance, so he was struggling on that front, and he had even had a heart attack that he survived. He said that his daughter was now 25 and that she lived nearby and had 2 children, but he didn't see them. He said that his daughter had her own emotional problems, and really he just wasn't a good father. He was arrested a second time for drunk driving and would lose his license. And at the time he was working, he was painting houses and taking odd jobs, so he would have to ride his bicycle everywhere. And then in 2011, he did pass away. So really, there's just no happy ending to this story. Irene, John, and Genie all suffered at the hands of an incredibly violent man. And even after his death, they all struggled with the abuse that he had inflicted upon them. And unfortunately, it didn't get better for any of them. We can only hope that Genie is in a safe and happy environment where she's allowed to do things like paint or color or draw pictures and explore the world the way that she was when researchers were helping her. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below, and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.